Sometimes the most profound moments in life happen in the most unexpected places. Picture this: a bustling military airfield where protocols rule everything, where rank determines respect, and where a single scar can tell a story worth more than any medal. What happens when the very system designed to honor heroes fails to recognize one standing right in front of them? This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a woman whose journey from battlefield to boarding gate revealed the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and the power of one person to change everything with a simple act of recognition. In a world where appearances often deceive and first impressions can be devastatingly wrong, sometimes it takes the trained eye of experience to see past the surface and recognize the warrior within. This is more than just a story about military protocol or boarding procedures. It's about human dignity, the invisible wounds of war, and how a moment of understanding can transform not just one person's day, but their entire outlook on the value of their sacrifice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete runway at Dover Air Force Base as Lieutenant Sarah Chen approached the boarding gate for Military Air Transport Flight 447. Her worn duffel bag hung heavy on her shoulder, containing everything she owned after 18 months deployed in Afghanistan. The familiar weight felt comforting, like an old friend accompanying her on this journey home. Sarah walked with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. The injury wasn't visible beneath her dress uniform, but each step reminded her of that devastating day in Kandahar when her convoy hit an improvised explosive device. The blast had changed everything, leaving her with more than just physical scars. But today wasn't about dwelling on the past. Today was about going home. The boarding area bustled with military personnel of various ranks, all waiting for their flight to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the first stop on their journey back to the States. Sarah found an empty chair near the gate and settled in, checking her watch. They had announced boarding would begin in 30 minutes, starting with senior officers and special circumstances passengers. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through messages from her family. Her mother had sent 17 texts since yesterday, each one expressing increasing excitement about Sarah's homecoming. Her younger brother Jake had shared photos of the welcome home banner he'd made, complete with glittery letters that read, "Our hero comes home." The simple gesture made Sarah's throat tight with emotion. A commotion near the gate caught her attention. A tall sergeant with an air of authority was checking boarding passes and directing passengers to different lines. Sergeant Rodriguez, according to his name tape, seemed to take his job very seriously. He scrutinized each document with the intensity of someone guarding classified secrets. Priority boarding for officers, wounded warriors, and special assignment personnel. Sergeant Rodriguez announced in a voice that carried across the waiting area. Please have your documentation ready for verification. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and retrieved her boarding pass along with her medical documentation. The papers felt heavy in her hands, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. The medical discharge forms, the Purple Heart citation, the disability rating documentation. Each piece of paper told part of a story, though none could capture the full picture of what she had endured. As the boarding line began to form, Sarah noticed a clear hierarchy taking shape. Colonels and majors moved to the front, their ranks gleaming on their shoulders like armor. Behind them, captains and lieutenants fell into place with practiced precision. Sarah took her place in line, her documentation clutched in her hand. When her turn came, she approached Sergeant Rodriguez with a slight smile. "Good morning, Sergeant. Flight 447 to Ramstein." Rodriguez looked up from his clipboard, his eyes quickly scanning Sarah's uniform. She could see him taking note of her lieutenant, bars, her service ribbons, and her overall appearance. His gaze lingered for a moment on her face, which still bore faint scars from the blast that had changed her life. "Documentation, please," he said curtly, extending his hand. Sarah handed over her boarding pass and began to reach for her medical papers when Rodriguez shook his head. "Just the boarding pass, Lieutenant. You'll need to move to the general boarding area. Priority boarding is for wounded personnel and special circumstances only."
The words hit Sarah like a physical blow.
She stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Around her, other passengers continued moving through the line, some glancing curiously at the holdup. "Sergeant, I have my medical documentation right here," Sarah said quietly, pulling the papers from her pocket. "I was wounded in action in Afghanistan. I have my Purple Heart citation and disability rating forms." Rodriguez barely glanced at the papers before shaking his head again. "Ma'am, I need official military medical transport documentation, not personal papers. Please move to the general boarding line." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, some sympathetic, others impatient to keep the line moving. The rejection felt like more than just a boarding issue. It felt like her service, Her sacrifice was being dismissed. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. These are official military documents. I was medically discharged due to injuries sustained in combat. The Purple Heart is awarded by the United States Army for wounds received in action. The sergeant's expression remained unmoved. Ma'am, I understand what a Purple Heart is. But without proper transport documentation, I cannot allow priority boarding. Military regulations are clear. Please step aside and allow the line to continue moving. Sarah felt something inside her crack. Not break, but crack, like ice under pressure. She had spent months in military hospitals, enduring countless surgeries and rehabilitation sessions. She had fought to walk again, to function again, to find some semblance of the person she had been before that roadside bomb tore through her convoy. And now, standing in line to board a plane home, she was being told that her sacrifice wasn't documented properly enough to warrant a few minutes of consideration. But Sarah Chen hadn't survived 18 months in a war zone by giving up easily. She straightened her shoulders, despite the pain that shot through her damaged leg, and tried one more time. Sergeant, I understand you're following protocols, but I'm asking you to look at these documents. My medical discharge papers clearly state the nature of my injuries and my Purple Heart citation. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for recognition of what I've already given. The conversation was drawing attention now. Other passengers in line were beginning to murmur among themselves. Some seemed annoyed by the delay, while others appeared sympathetic to Sarah's situation. But Sergeant Rodriguez remained unmoved. Lieutenant, I've made my decision. Please move to the general boarding area or I'll have to call security to remove you from the line. The threat of security being called felt like the final insult. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some uncomfortable, all witnessing her humiliation. She thought about all the times she had been told that her service mattered, that her sacrifice had meaning, that wounded warriors were honored and respected. Standing there in that boarding line, those words felt empty. She was about to step aside, to accept defeat, and move to the back of the line with her head down, when something inside her rebelled. Not the angry, destructive kind of rebellion, but the quiet, determined kind that had gotten her through the darkest moments of her recovery. She decided that if she was going to be denied, it wouldn't be without one final attempt to make her case. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. I've served this country for 8 years. I've been deployed 3 times, wounded twice, and medically discharged due to injuries that will affect me for the rest of my life. I'm not asking you to bend the rules. I'm asking you to acknowledge that these documents represent legitimate proof of my status as a wounded warrior. The boarding area had grown quieter, with more people turning their attention to the scene unfolding at the gate. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but for the first time since approaching the gate, she didn't feel small or insignificant. She felt like the soldier she had always been, standing up for what was right. Rodriguez's jaw tightened, and Sarah could see that her persistence was beginning to annoy him. Ma'am, for the last time, I need you to move to the general boarding line. I will not discuss this further. As Sarah stood there weighing her options and fighting back tears of frustration, she didn't notice the tall figure in dress blues approaching from behind. She didn't see the eagle insignia on his shoulders or the numerous ribbons and decorations that marked him as a senior officer. She was too focused on the battle playing out in front of her, a battle that felt like it represented so much more than just boarding a plane. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, casting everything in a golden light that seemed to mock the darkness Sarah felt settling over her. She had come so far, fought so hard, and overcome so much. But standing there in that line, facing rejection and dismissal, she wondered if any of it had really mattered at all. Little did she know that her story was about to take a dramatic turn, and that sometimes the most important battles are won, not through force or anger, but through the simple power of one person choosing to see and acknowledge another person's worth. The next few minutes would change not only Sarah's flight experience, but her entire perspective on the value of her service and the meaning of true recognition. In that moment of seeming defeat, with her documentation clutched in her trembling hand and her dignity under assault, Sarah Chen was about to learn that sometimes the universe provides exactly the witness you need, exactly when you need them most, and sometimes that witness wears the stars of a general and has the power to right the wrongs that regulations and rigid thinking can create. The boarding gate at Dover Air Force Base was about to become the stage for a lesson in honor, recognition, and the true meaning of military service. But first, Sarah had to endure just a little more of what felt like the longest few minutes of her life. General Marcus Thompson had been walking through Dover Air Force Base with the measured stride of someone who had spent 35 years in military service. At 62, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts and had risen through the ranks not just because of his strategic mind, but because of his unwavering commitment to the men and women who served under the American flag. This morning, he was conducting an impromptu inspection of base operations, something he did regularly to ensure that the high standards he expected were being maintained throughout the facility. Dover was a crucial hub for military air transport, and General Thompson believed that every aspect of its operation should reflect the excellence and dignity that American service members deserved. As he approached the passenger terminal, he could hear raised voices coming from the boarding area. This wasn't unusual. Military travel could be stressful, and tensions sometimes ran high when dealing with complex logistics and rigid schedules. But something about the tone of this particular conversation caught his attention. It wasn't the usual grumbling about delays or confusion about seating assignments. This sounded different, more serious. General Thompson had developed a sixth sense about these things over his decades of service. He could distinguish between minor complaints and situations that required attention. The conversation he was hearing fell into the latter category. He quickened his pace slightly, his curiosity piqued. As he rounded the corner and entered the boarding area, he could see a crowd had gathered around Gate 12. Military personnel of various ranks stood in loose clusters, some openly watching whatever was happening at the front of the line, others pretending not to notice while stealing glances when they thought no one was looking. The general positioned himself where he could observe without immediately interfering. From his vantage point, he could see a young lieutenant standing at the boarding gate, facing off with a sergeant who appeared to be checking documentation. Even from a distance, General Thompson could sense the tension in the situation. He moved closer, weaving through the crowd with the quiet authority that came naturally to someone of his rank and experience. As he approached, he began to catch fragments of the conversation. Official military medical transport documentation, not personal papers. These are official military documents. I was medically discharged due to injuries sustained in combat. Without proper transport documentation, I cannot allow priority boarding. General Thompson's eyes narrowed as he began to understand what was happening. He had seen too many situations like this over the years, where rigid adherence to procedure overrode common sense and basic human decency. It was one of his greatest frustrations with military bureaucracy, and he had made it his mission to address such issues whenever he encountered them. As he continued to move closer, he got his first clear look at the lieutenant in question. She was a small woman, probably in her late 20s, wearing a dress uniform that looked like it had been carefully maintained despite obvious wear. Her posture was erect despite what appeared to be some discomfort, and she held a stack of papers in her hand with the careful attention of someone who had learned to guard important documents. But it was when General Thompson saw her face that he truly began to pay attention. Even from several feet away, he could see the faint network of scars across her left cheek and temple. They were the kind of scars that told a story, the kind that came from explosive devices and flying debris. They were healing scars, several months old at least, but still visible enough to mark her as someone who had seen combat. The general had seen enough wounded warriors over his career to recognize the signs. The way she favored her left leg, the careful way she moved, the set of her shoulders that spoke of someone who had learned to carry pain without complaint. This wasn't someone trying to game the system or take advantage of regulations. This was a soldier who had paid a price for her service. He edged closer still, wanting to hear more of the conversation before deciding how to proceed. The sergeant at the gate was speaking again, and his tone was becoming increasingly dismissive. "Ma'am, for the last time, I need you to move to the general boarding line. I will not discuss this further." General Thompson saw the lieutenant's shoulders sag slightly at these words, and he felt a familiar anger building in his chest. Not the explosive kind of anger that led to shouting matches, but the cold, focused anger of someone who had seen good soldiers treated poorly by a system that was supposed to support them. He had been in situations like this before, where dedicated service members found themselves caught in bureaucratic tangles that made no sense to anyone with actual combat experience. He had seen wounded warriors denied services they had earned, families separated by inflexible policies, and heroes treated like inconveniences by people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. But what struck him most about this particular situation was the dignity with which the young lieutenant was handling her treatment. Despite the obvious frustration and hurt in her voice, she hadn't raised her voice or become belligerent. She was making her case calmly and professionally, even as she was being dismissed and humiliated in front of her peers. General Thompson stepped forward slightly. positioning himself where he could see the documents the lieutenant was holding. From his angle, he could make out the distinctive letterhead of military medical discharge papers and what appeared to be an official citation. Even from a distance, the purple and gold ribbon of a Purple Heart was clearly visible among her service decorations. This wasn't a case of someone trying to circumvent procedures or claim benefits they hadn't earned. This was a wounded warrior with legitimate documentation being turned away because her paperwork didn't match some narrow interpretation of boarding protocols. It was exactly the kind of situation that made General Thompson question whether the military bureaucracy had lost sight of its primary mission, supporting the men and women who served. He watched as the lieutenant made one final attempt to present her case, her voice carrying across the boarding area with a strength that belied her small stature. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I've served this country for 8 years. I've been deployed 3 times, wounded twice, and medically discharged due to injuries that will affect me for the rest of my life. I'm not asking you to bend the rules. I'm asking you to acknowledge that these documents represent legitimate proof of my status as a wounded warrior." The words hit General Thompson like a physical force. 8 years of service, 3 deployments, wounded twice, and now standing in a boarding line being told that her sacrifice wasn't properly documented. It was unconscionable. He could see other passengers beginning to take notice of the situation. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed annoyed by the delay, and a few appeared sympathetic to the lieutenant's plight, but none of them were stepping forward to intervene or offer support. They were all waiting for someone else to handle the situation. General Thompson had learned long ago that leadership meant stepping forward when others stepped back. It meant recognizing when the system was failing and having the courage to intervene, even when it might be easier to walk away and pretend you hadn't seen anything. He looked around the boarding area, taking note of the various ranks and units represented. There were field-grade officers present who outranked the sergeant at the gate, but none of them were intervening. There were senior NCOs who had the experience to recognize what was happening, but they were keeping their distance. Everyone seemed content to let someone else's problem remain someone else's problem. This was exactly the kind of institutional failure that General Thompson had spent his career fighting against. The idea that a wounded warrior could be treated dismissively while dozens of other service members stood by and watched was antithetical to everything he believed about military values and the obligations that came with wearing the uniform. He began walking toward the gate with purpose, his stride carrying the unmistakable authority of senior command. As he approached, several of the onlookers noticed his rank insignia and began to straighten up, suddenly aware that they were in the presence of General Officer. The conversation at the gate was continuing, with Sergeant Rodriguez maintaining his inflexible position despite the lieutenant's calm but persistent efforts to explain her situation. General Thompson could hear the frustration beginning to creep into both voices, and he knew that the situation was reaching a breaking point. As he drew closer, he began to formulate his approach. He had learned that the most effective interventions were often the quietest ones. Rather than charging in with rank and authority blazing, he preferred to gather information first, and then address the situation in a way that preserved dignity for everyone involved, while ensuring that the right outcome was achieved. But he also knew that time was a factor. The lieutenant was clearly reaching the end of her patience, and Sergeant Rodriguez was showing signs of escalating the situation by threatening to call security. If General Thompson was going to intervene, it needed to be soon, before the situation deteriorated beyond repair. He paused for a moment, about 10 feet from the gate, close enough to hear every word but far enough away to avoid immediately drawing attention to his presence. He wanted to understand exactly what was happening, and what documents the lieutenant possessed before revealing his interest in the situation. From this distance, he could see more clearly the toll that the confrontation was taking on the young woman. Despite her professional demeanor, he could see the slight tremor in her hands as she held her papers, the way she was shifting her weight to favor her injured leg, and the barely contained emotion in her eyes. It reminded him of his own daughter, who had served 2 tours in Iraq as a combat medic before being wounded by a roadside bomb. He remembered the struggles she had faced navigating the military medical system, the bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to frustrate rather than help, and the way the system sometimes seemed to view wounded warriors as burdens rather than heroes. That personal connection, combined with his professional obligation to ensure that service members were treated with dignity and respect, sealed his decision to intervene. The only question now was how to do it in a way that would achieve the best outcome for everyone involved, particularly for the lieutenant who was clearly fighting a battle she shouldn't have to fight. General Thompson took a deep breath and began his approach to the gate, knowing that the next few minutes would likely change the trajectory of the morning for everyone involved. He had the power to fix this situation, and he intended to use it. But first, he wanted to get a closer look at exactly what was happening and what documentation was being dismissed so readily. As he stepped forward, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Among the ribbons on the lieutenant's uniform, he could clearly see not just the Purple Heart, but also the Bronze Star and the Combat Medical Badge. This wasn't just a wounded warrior being treated dismissively. This was a decorated combat veteran, someone who had clearly distinguished herself in service to her country. The sight of those decorations being ignored while their wearer was humiliated at a boarding gate was more than General Thompson could tolerate. His pace quickened as he approached the confrontation, his mind already working through the conversation he was about to have with Sergeant Rodriguez about the proper treatment of wounded warriors and the true meaning of military service. "Excuse me, Sergeant Rodriguez." The voice cut through the tension at the boarding gate like a blade through silk, deep, authoritative, and carrying the unmistakable tone of senior command. It caused an immediate hush to fall over the surrounding area. Every conversation stopped, every head turned, and every person within earshot suddenly stood a little straighter. Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his clipboard, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of General Thompson approaching. The general's dress blue uniform was immaculate, his ribbons and decorations telling the story of a distinguished military career spanning multiple conflicts. But it was the eagles on his shoulders that commanded immediate attention and respect. "General Thompson, sir," Rodriguez said quickly, snapping to attention. "How may I assist you, sir?" Sarah turned as well, surprised by the sudden change in atmosphere. She had been so focused on her confrontation with the sergeant that she hadn't noticed the general approaching. Now, standing just a few feet away, she could see the man who had inadvertently become witness to her humiliation. She felt a mixture of hope and embarrassment wash over her. General Thompson moved with deliberate calm, his eyes taking in the entire scene. He could see the stack of documents in Sarah's hand, the frustration and hurt barely concealed in her expression, and the defensive posture that Rodriguez had assumed upon recognizing his rank. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," the general said, his voice carrying easily despite its measured tone. "I was hoping you could help me understand the situation here." Rodriguez glanced nervously between the general and Sarah, clearly uncomfortable with having his decision scrutinized by such senior authority. "Sir, this lieutenant was attempting to board with priority status, but she doesn't have the proper documentation for wounded warrior transport. I was following standard operating procedures." "I see," General Thompson said, nodding thoughtfully. He turned to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. "Lieutenant, would you mind sharing your name and unit?" "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, sir, 4th Infantry Division." "Recently medically discharged from Fort Carson," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her emotional state. She could hardly believe that a general officer was taking an interest in her situation. "And you were attempting to board with priority status based on what documentation?" the general asked, his tone conversational rather than interrogating. Sarah held up her papers, her hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I have my medical discharge papers, my Purple Heart citation, and my disability rating documentation. I was wounded in action in Afghanistan and am traveling home after completing my medical out-processing." General Thompson extended his hand. "May I take a look at those documents, Lieutenant?" Sarah handed over her papers immediately, watching nervously as the general reviewed them with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. She could see his eyes moving across the pages, taking in the details of her service record, her injuries, and her decorations. The boarding area had grown quiet, with everyone within sight distance aware that something significant was happening at Gate 12. Other passengers stood in respectful silence, watching as the general examined the documents that had been dismissed so readily just minutes before. General Thompson took his time with the papers, reading through the medical discharge summary that detailed Sarah's injuries from the IED blast. Traumatic brain injury, compound fracture of the left femur, multiple lacerations, hearing loss in her left ear. The clinical language couldn't capture the pain and struggle those injuries represented, but it painted a clear picture of someone who had paid a significant price for her service. He looked at the Purple Heart citation next, noting the date and location of the action that had earned her the decoration. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Road clearance mission. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. The same clinical language, but General Thompson had enough experience to read between the lines and understand the chaos and terror that those simple words represented. The disability rating forms told another part of the story. Permanent partial disability due to combat injuries. Entitled to all benefits and considerations accorded to wounded warriors. The bureaucratic language was clear and unambiguous. This was not a borderline case or a questionable claim. This was a legitimate wounded warrior with all the documentation anyone could reasonably require. When he looked up from the papers, General Thompson's expression had hardened considerably. He turned back to Sergeant Rodriguez, who was standing at rigid attention, clearly aware that his handling of the situation was under intense scrutiny. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the general said quietly, "can you explain to me why these documents are insufficient for priority boarding?" Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. His confidence from earlier completely evaporated. "Sir, the regulations require specific transport documentation for wounded warrior status. Personal medical documents aren't sufficient according to the standard operating procedures I was given." "And who provided you with these standard operating procedures?" General Thompson asked, his voice maintaining its calm tone despite the edge that was beginning to creep in. "My supervisor, sir, Sergeant First Class Williams. He briefed all gate personnel on the documentation requirements for priority boarding." General Thompson nodded slowly, filing that information away for later follow-up. "I see. And in your interpretation of these procedures, official military medical discharge papers, a Purple Heart citation, and disability rating documentation from the Department of Veterans Affairs don't constitute sufficient proof of wounded warrior status?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez was clearly struggling with how to respond, caught between his interpretation of regulations and the obvious displeasure of a general officer who clearly disagreed with his assessment. "Sir, I was told to be strict about documentation to prevent abuse of the priority boarding system," Rodriguez said, his voice much less confident than it had been earlier. "Prevent abuse," General Thompson repeated, his tone suggesting that he found the concept interesting. "Sergeant, do you see anything about Lieutenant Chen or her documentation that suggests abuse of the system?" Rodriguez looked over at Sarah, really looking at her for the first time since the confrontation began. He could see the scars on her face, the way she favored her left leg, the genuine emotion in her eyes that spoke of someone who had endured real trauma. The stack of official documents in the general's hands told a story that was impossible to fake. "No, sir," Rodriguez said quietly. "I don't see any indication of abuse." "Then perhaps you can explain why a decorated combat veteran with obvious combat injuries and complete documentation was denied the courtesy that we extend to wounded warriors." The general's voice remained level, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath his words. Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. After months of feeling forgotten and dismissed by various bureaucratic systems, here was someone with real authority, taking her side and demanding answers. It was almost surreal. General Thompson turned back to Sarah, his expression softening again. "Lieutenant Chen, I want to apologize on behalf of the United States Air Force for the treatment you've received here today. Your service and sacrifice deserve better recognition than you've been given." "Thank you, sir," Sarah managed to say, her throat tight with emotion. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble, I just wanted to get home." "You weren't causing trouble, Lieutenant. You were standing up for yourself and demanding the respect you've earned. That's what good soldiers do." The general handed her documents back to her, making sure she had a firm grip on them before letting go. "These documents are more than sufficient for any reasonable interpretation of wounded warrior protocols." He turned back to Rodriguez, who was still standing at attention. "Sergeant, I want you to personally escort Lieutenant Chen to priority boarding and ensure she has everything she needs for her journey home. Do you understand?"
Yes, sir.
"Absolutely, sir. Furthermore, I want you to arrange for her to have an aisle seat with extra legroom, given her mobility limitations. Can you make that happen?" "Yes, sir. I'll contact the aircraft crew immediately." General Thompson nodded, then addressed the growing crowd of onlookers. "I'd like everyone to understand what you've witnessed here today. This is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a Purple Heart recipient and combat veteran who served 3 deployments in Afghanistan. She was wounded in action while serving her country, and she deserves our respect and support, not bureaucratic obstacles." A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the passengers. Some of the senior officers present stepped forward to shake Sarah's hand and thank her for her service. The atmosphere that had been tense and uncomfortable just minutes before was now filled with recognition and respect. But General Thompson wasn't finished. He had been in the military long enough to know that individual interventions, while important, didn't address systemic problems. If Sarah had been treated this way, how many other wounded warriors had faced similar dismissive treatment? How many had simply accepted the rejection and moved to the back of the line without fighting back? "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, "after Lieutenant Chen is properly situated, I want you to contact Sergeant First Class Williams and ask him to meet me in the Terminal Commander's office in 1 hour. We need to have a discussion about these standard operating procedures and how they're being implemented." "Yes, sir. I'll contact him immediately." "Good. And Sergeant, I want you to think carefully about what happened here today. Regulations exist to create order and fairness, not to create barriers for the people we're supposed to be serving. A good NCO knows the difference between following rules and following the spirit behind those rules. Rodriguez nodded, clearly chastened, but also seemingly genuinely understanding the point being made. I understand, sir. I'll do better. General Thompson studied the young sergeant for a moment, seeing not malicious intent but misguided priorities that could be corrected with proper guidance. I believe you will, Sergeant. This is a learning opportunity, not a career-ending mistake, but learn from it. As Rodriguez moved to make arrangements for Sarah's boarding, General Thompson turned his attention back to her. He could see that the emotional toll of the morning was beginning to catch up with her, now that the immediate crisis had passed. Lieutenant Chen, do you have family waiting for you at your destination? He asked gently.
Yes, sir.
My parents and my brother. They're picking me up at Baltimore. Sarah's voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. That's wonderful. Family support is crucial during the transition back to civilian life. Have you given any thought to what comes next for you? Sarah hesitated, clearly not having expected such a personal question from a general officer. I'm still figuring that out, sir. The injuries have changed some of my original plans, but I'm exploring options for continuing my education or finding meaningful work. General Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. I want you to contact my aide, Captain Morrison, next week. We have programs designed to help wounded warriors transition to civilian careers, particularly those with strong service records like yours. I'd like to make sure you're aware of all your options. Sarah took the card with trembling hands, hardly believing the turn her day had taken. Thank you, sir. I don't know how to express how much this means to me. You don't need to express anything, Lieutenant. You've already given more than enough. Now it's our turn to give back to you. The general smiled, and for the first time since she'd approached the boarding gate, Sarah felt genuinely valued and respected. The boarding announcement came over the intercom, calling for priority passengers to begin boarding. Rodriguez approached with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to personally ensure that Sarah's boarding experience was everything it should have been from the beginning. As Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to board the aircraft, she reflected on how dramatically her morning had changed. She had started the day feeling dismissed and forgotten, questioning whether her service had really mattered. Now she was boarding with dignity and respect, with the personal intervention of a general officer who had gone out of his way to ensure she was treated properly. But perhaps most importantly, she was boarding with renewed faith in the military family she was leaving behind. Despite the initial failure of the system, when it mattered most, that system had produced someone who cared enough to step forward and make things right. That knowledge would travel with her as she headed home to begin the next chapter of her life. The interior of the C-130 transport aircraft was everything Sarah had expected and nothing she had hoped for. The military didn't design these planes for comfort, but for functionality and durability. Rows of red webbing seats stretched along both sides of the cargo area, with a central space filled with equipment pallets and supplies. The air smelled of jet fuel, metal, and the faint mustiness that came from countless previous passengers. But today, none of that mattered to Sarah. As she settled into her aisle seat with extra legroom, personally arranged by Sergeant Rodriguez under the watchful eye of General Thompson, she felt a sense of dignity and recognition that had been missing from too many of her recent interactions with the military system. The seat assignment was more than just a practical accommodation for her injured leg. It was a symbol of respect, a tangible acknowledgement that her service mattered and that her sacrifice was valued. After months of feeling invisible in medical waiting rooms and forgotten in bureaucratic processes, this simple gesture of recognition meant everything. Flight Sergeant Maria Santos, the loadmaster responsible for passenger safety and comfort during the flight, approached Sarah as the boarding process continued. Santos was a career Air Force NCO with 15 years of experience managing military transport operations, and she had clearly been briefed about Sarah's situation. Lieutenant Chen, Santos said with a warm smile, I wanted to personally welcome you aboard and make sure you have everything you need for the flight. Do you require any assistance with your baggage or seating arrangement?
No, thank you, Flight Sergeant.
Everything is perfect, Sarah replied, still somewhat amazed by the level of attention she was receiving. The contrast with her treatment at the boarding gate couldn't have been more stark. Excellent. The flight to Ramstein will take approximately 7 hours, with one refueling stop in Ireland. We'll have meal service after takeoff, and I'll check on you periodically during the flight to make sure you're comfortable. Santos paused, her expression becoming more serious. I also wanted to say thank you for your service, Lieutenant. We don't always get the chance to properly recognize our wounded warriors, and I'm honored to have you aboard my aircraft." The simple words of thanks, delivered without fanfare or obligation, struck Sarah more deeply than she expected. After months of feeling like a burden on the medical system, being thanked for her service by someone who understood its cost was profoundly moving. As other passengers continued to board, Sarah noticed several fellow service members making their way to seats throughout the aircraft. Some were returning from deployments, others were traveling to new assignments, and a few appeared to be making the same journey home that she was. The diversity of ranks, units, and purposes represented the full spectrum of military service. Across the aisle from Sarah, a young private first class was struggling with an oversized duffel bag, clearly new to military travel and uncertain about the protocols. Without thinking, Sarah leaned over and offered guidance. "First military flight?" she asked with a smile. The private nodded, looking grateful for the friendly interaction.
Yes, man.
PFC Martinez, 82nd Airborne. "I'm heading to Germany for my first overseas assignment. Lieutenant Chen, 4th Infantry. Germany's a great assignment. You'll learn a lot and see some amazing places. Just remember to pack your cold weather gear when you get there." German winters are no joke. As they talked, Sarah found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of mentoring junior soldiers, something that had always been one of her favorite aspects of military service. Despite her own struggles and injuries, she still felt a responsibility to help others navigate the challenges of military life. The conversation with Martinez reminded her of her own first military flight, 8 years earlier, when she had been just as nervous and uncertain. She had been so young then, so eager to prove herself and make a difference. The idealism of that young soldier seemed like a lifetime ago, tempered now by experience, loss, and the hard-earned wisdom that came from surviving combat. As the aircraft engines wound up to take off power, Sarah felt the familiar vibration and noise that accompanied the beginning of every military flight. She had made this journey many times before, but never under these circumstances. This wasn't a deployment to an unknown destination or a mission into uncertainty. This was the final flight of her military career, the last time she would travel as an active-duty soldier. The realization brought a wave of mixed emotions that she hadn't fully prepared for. Pride in what she had accomplished, sadness at what she was leaving behind, uncertainty about what came next, and gratitude for still being alive to make this journey at all. Many of her fellow soldiers hadn't been as fortunate. She thought about her squad in Afghanistan, the soldiers she had served with during her final deployment. Sergeant Williams, who had saved her life by pulling her from the wreckage of their vehicle after the IED blast. Corporal Thompson, who had provided covering fire while the medics worked to stabilize her injuries. Specialist Rodriguez, who had held her hand during the helicopter evacuation and told her jokes to keep her conscious. Some of them were still deployed, still facing the daily dangers that she had left behind. Others had completed their tours and returned home to resume their lives. A few hadn't made it home at all, their names now etched in stone at Arlington National Cemetery. The survivor's guilt that she carried was a constant companion, a weight that no amount of physical therapy or counseling could completely lift. But today, sitting in this aircraft heading home, she also felt something else. Hope. The intervention by General Thompson had reminded her that her service mattered, that her sacrifice was recognized, and that there were people in positions of authority who cared about doing the right thing. It was a powerful antidote to the cynicism and disappointment that had been building up over months of bureaucratic struggles. The flight reached cruising altitude, and the aircraft settled into the steady drone of long-distance transport. Sarah pulled out her phone to review the messages that had accumulated during the boarding process. Her mother had sent another text expressing excitement about her homecoming. Her brother had shared a photo of the grocery store, asking what snacks she wanted him to pick up for her arrival. But there was also a new message, one that made her heart skip a beat. It was from her former squad leader, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who was still deployed in Afghanistan. "Chen, heard through the grapevine that you're finally heading home today. Wanted you to know that the whole squad is thinking about you. We know this transition is tough, but you're the strongest person we know. Don't forget that you saved 3 lives that day, including mine. That matters. That will always matter. Welcome home, soldier." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over again. She had saved 3 lives that day. In all the focus on her own injuries and struggles, she had somehow lost sight of the fact that her actions during the IED attack had prevented other families from receiving death notifications. She remembered now, with crystal clarity, the moments immediately following the explosion. Despite her own injuries, she had managed to drag an unconscious soldier from the burning vehicle. She had applied tourniquets to 2 wounded team members before the medics arrived. She had coordinated with the Quick Reaction Force to secure the area and call for evacuation helicopters. Those actions, performed while she was bleeding and disoriented from her own wounds, had made the difference between life and death for 3 of her fellow soldiers. It was the reason she had been recommended for the Bronze Star that now hung among her other decorations. But in the months of pain and rehabilitation that followed, she had somehow forgotten the heroism that had preceded her injuries. Torres's message brought that memory flooding back, along with a renewed sense of pride in her service. Yes, she had been wounded. Yes, her military career had ended earlier than planned, but she had made a difference. She had saved lives. She had embodied the values of courage, sacrifice, and service that defined the best of the military tradition. Flight Sergeant Santos stopped by to check on Sarah during the meal service, bringing her a hot meal and a cup of coffee that was surprisingly good by military standards. "How are you doing, Lieutenant? Everything okay with your seating?"
"Everything's perfect, Flight Sergeant. Thank you for taking such good care of me."
Santos sat down in the empty seat next to Sarah for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something, Lieutenant? What happened at the boarding gate this morning?" "I heard there was some kind of incident, but I didn't get the full story." Sarah hesitated, not wanting to make trouble for anyone, but also feeling like the story was worth telling. "There was a misunderstanding about documentation for priority boarding. A sergeant thought my papers weren't sufficient for wounded warrior status." "But you're clearly a wounded warrior," Santos said, looking puzzled. "I can see your decorations, and your medical status is noted in our passenger manifest." That's what General Thompson pointed out when he intervened. "I think it was more about rigid interpretation of regulations than malicious intent." Santos nodded knowingly. "I've seen that before. Sometimes people get so focused on following rules that they forget why those rules exist in the first place. We have wounded warrior protocols specifically to honor people like you who have paid a price for their service." The general made the same point. He was incredibly kind and professional about the whole situation. "General Thompson is a good leader," Santos agreed. "He's got a reputation for taking care of soldiers and doing the right thing, even when it's not convenient or easy."
As Santos returned to her duties, Sarah reflected on the conversation.
The boarding gate incident, which had seemed so devastating at the time, was already beginning to feel like a learning opportunity rather than a personal attack. The intervention by General Thompson had transformed what could have been a bitter memory into a reminder of the best aspects of military leadership. She thought about Rodriguez, the sergeant who had initially denied her boarding. His rigid interpretation of regulations had been frustrating and hurtful, but she could see now that it had come from a desire to do his job correctly rather than any malicious intent. The general's approach to correcting the situation while preserving Rodriguez's dignity had been a masterclass in leadership. That kind of leadership, the kind that could address problems while building up rather than tearing down, was something Sarah hoped to carry forward into whatever career came next. Whether she ended up in education, public service, or the private sector, the lessons she had learned about dignity, respect, and standing up for what was right would serve her well. The aircraft hit some turbulence over the Atlantic, causing a few nervous moments among the passengers. Sarah barely noticed. She had been through real turbulence, the kind that came from roadside bombs and enemy fire. A little rough air at 30,000 feet seemed trivial in comparison. As the flight progressed, she found herself looking forward to the next phase of her journey with increasing excitement rather than apprehension. The business card from General Thompson represented opportunities she hadn't known existed. The support from her family provided a foundation for whatever came next, and her own strength, proven through months of recovery and rehabilitation, gave her confidence that she could handle whatever challenges awaited her. She was going home not as a broken soldier, but as a wounded warrior who had served with honor and distinction. The difference between those two perspectives was everything, and it had taken the intervention of a caring general officer to help her see it clearly. The flight to Ramstein stretched on through the night, carrying Sarah and her fellow passengers across an ocean toward their various destinations. But for Sarah, the most important part of the journey had already been completed. She had rediscovered her sense of worth and purpose, and she was carrying them home with her like precious cargo that nothing could damage or destroy. The commercial airliner descended through thick clouds toward Baltimore-Washington International Airport, marking the final leg of Sarah's journey home. After the military transport to Germany and an overnight layover in Frankfurt, this civilian flight felt almost luxurious with its cushioned seats, individual entertainment systems, and flight attendants who offered drinks without being asked. Sarah pressed her face to the window as familiar landmarks came into view below. The Chesapeake Bay stretched out like a silver mirror in the afternoon sunlight, dotted with sailboats and crossed by the twin spans of the Bay Bridge. She could see the distinctive skyline of Baltimore in the distance, and beyond that, the sprawling suburbs where her family had waited anxiously for her return. It had been 18 months since she had seen this view. 18 months since she had last been truly home. The Sarah Chen who had deployed to Afghanistan had been confident, eager, and unaware of how dramatically her life could change in a single moment. The Sarah Chen who was coming home today carried scars both visible and invisible, hard-earned wisdom about the cost of service, and a renewed appreciation for the simple gift of being alive. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages as the aircraft's wireless system connected to the domestic cellular network. Her mother had sent a series of increasingly excited texts documenting the family's preparation for her arrival. Photos of her childhood bedroom, restored to its original state, pictures of her favorite Chinese dishes being prepared in the kitchen, a video of her father hanging a welcome home banner across the front porch. But it was the message from her younger brother Jake that made her smile most broadly. Sarah, I know this transition is going to be tough, but I want you to know that we're all incredibly proud of you. You're our hero, and nothing will ever change that. Can't wait to hear your stories and help you figure out what comes next. P.S. I bought a case of your favorite ice cream, so we're ready for some serious catch-up sessions. The simple message, written with the earnest affection that only family could provide, reminded Sarah of one of the most important truths about coming home. No matter what she had endured, no matter how she had changed, she was returning to people who loved her unconditionally. That foundation of support would make all the difference in the challenges ahead. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation building in her chest. She had been looking forward to this moment for months, but now that it was here, she found herself wondering how different she would seem to her family. Would they see the changes that military service and combat injuries had made in her? Would they understand the person she had become? The boarding bridge extended to the aircraft with a slight mechanical shudder, and passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Sarah took her time, knowing that her family was waiting in the terminal, but wanting to savor these last few moments of transition between her military life and whatever came next. The flight attendant, who had been particularly attentive during the flight, stopped by Sarah's seat as she prepared to leave. Lieutenant, I wanted to thank you for your service and wish you the very best as you head home. It was an honor to have you aboard our aircraft today.
Thank you, Sarah replied, touched by the gesture.
That means more than you know. Walking through the jetway toward the terminal, Sarah's limp was more pronounced than usual, a result of sitting for extended periods during the long journey home. But she straightened her shoulders and adjusted her uniform, determined to meet her family with the dignity and bearing that befitted the soldier she had been and would always be. The gate area was crowded with typical airport chaos. Business travelers rushing to connections, families reuniting with loved ones, and the general bustle of people going about their lives. But as Sarah emerged from the jetway, she spotted them immediately. Her family was clustered near the gate, holding balloons and a banner that read, "Our hero comes home," in glittery letters that caught the terminal lighting. Her mother, Dr. Linda Chen, was scanning every face that emerged from the aircraft with the intensity of someone who had been counting down minutes for weeks. Her father, David Chen, stood with quiet dignity, his engineer's mind probably calculating exactly when she should appear based on the aircraft's arrival time. And her brother Jake bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement, clutching a bouquet of flowers that he had clearly chosen himself. When their eyes met, everything else in the terminal seemed to fade away. Her mother's face lit up with a joy so pure and overwhelming that it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Her father's usual reserve cracked completely, revealing an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show in public. And Jake simply dropped the flowers and started running toward her. "Sarah!" her mother called out, her voice carrying across the busy terminal. "Sarah, you're home." The reunion was everything Sarah had hoped it would be and more. Her mother's embrace was fierce and protective, as if she could somehow shield her daughter from all the pain and trauma of the past 18 months, through sheer force of love. Her father's hug was gentler but no less emotional, his engineer's hands carefully mindful of her injuries while conveying all the worry and pride he had carried during her deployment. Jake's enthusiasm was infectious and healing in its simplicity. "Sarah, you look amazing." "I mean, different, but amazing. Did you bring me anything cool from Afghanistan? Not that it matters, but I was hoping for something with camouflage on it." Despite everything she had been through, or perhaps because of it, Sarah found herself laughing at her brother's priorities. I've got a whole bag of stuff for you, Jake, including a genuine military field cap in your size. That's so cool. Wait until I show my friends. They're going to be so jealous. As the initial excitement of the reunion settled into something more sustainable, Sarah's mother took a step back and really looked at her daughter for the first time. Sarah could see her taking note of the scars, the way she favored her left leg, the subtle changes that 18 months of military service and combat injuries had made. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" her mother asked, her physician's training making her automatically assess her daughter's condition. "I'm doing well, Mum. Much better than I was a few months ago. The physical therapy has helped a lot, and I'm getting stronger every day." Her father moved to her other side, and Sarah found herself supported and surrounded by family in a way that felt both familiar and profoundly healing. "We're so proud of you, Sarah," he said quietly. "Not just for your service, but for how you've handled everything that came after. Your strength has been an inspiration to all of us." As they made their way through the terminal toward baggage claim, Sarah found herself telling them about the boarding gate incident and General Thompson's intervention. Her family listened with a mixture of outrage at her initial treatment and admiration for the General's leadership. "I'd like to meet this General Thompson someday," her father said. "Anyone who looks out for my daughter like that deserves my personal thanks. Actually, he gave me his aide's contact information and said there might be opportunities for wounded warriors that I should explore. I'm planning to follow up next week." Her mother's face brightened considerably at this news. "That sounds wonderful, Sarah. It's so important to have people in your corner who understand what you've been through and can help you navigate the transition." At baggage claim, Sarah was surprised to discover that her single duffel bag looked almost pitifully small among the mountains of luggage that other passengers were collecting. Everything she owned after 8 years of military service fit into one worn canvas bag. But rather than feeling sad about this, she found it oddly liberating. She was starting fresh, with minimal baggage, both literal and metaphorical. The drive home through familiar neighborhoods was a sensory experience that brought back a flood of memories. The smell of spring air through the car windows, the sight of cherry trees in bloom along the suburban streets, the sound of children playing in yards that had been empty and quiet during her deployment winter. Everything looked smaller than she remembered. More peaceful, more precious. Her family's house appeared unchanged from her last visit, a modest 2-story colonial that had been home base throughout her childhood and military career. The welcome home banner stretched across the front porch fluttered gently in the afternoon breeze, and Sarah could see that her mother had planted new flowers in the window boxes especially for her arrival. But it was the yellow ribbon magnet on the family car and the small service flag in the front window that reminded Sarah how her deployment had affected not just her, but everyone who loved her. Her family had served too, in their own way, carrying the worry and fear that came with having a loved one in combat. Inside the house, everything was exactly as she remembered it, yet somehow different through her changed perspective. The family photos lining the hallway seemed more precious now that she understood how quickly life could change. The comfortable furniture in the living room looked incredibly luxurious after months of military cots and hospital beds. The smell of her mother's cooking drifting from the kitchen was like a direct connection to childhood comfort and security. Her bedroom had been restored to its pre-military state, with her high school track trophies back on the dresser and her college textbooks arranged on the desk. But her mother had also added new touches. A comfortable reading chair positioned near the window, blackout curtains for better sleep, and a small refrigerator stocked with her favorite drinks. "I thought you might need some space to adjust," her mother explained, showing her the modifications. "And if you need anything at all, you just have to ask. We want to help however we can." That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table for the first meal they had shared in 18 months. Her mother had prepared all of Sarah's favorite dishes, and the conversation flowed easily between updates on family news, neighborhood changes, and Sarah's plans for the future. But what struck Sarah most was how normal it all felt. Despite everything that had happened, despite how much she had changed, she was still their daughter, still their sister, still part of this family unit that had remained constant throughout her military career. After dinner, she and Jake sat on the front porch swing as the sun set behind the trees lining their street. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant sound of children playing and the occasional car passing by. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Jake asked eventually. "I mean, really okay? You seem different, but I can't figure out how." Sarah considered the question carefully. Was she okay? In many ways, she was more than okay. She was alive, she was home, she was surrounded by people who loved her. She had served her country with honor and distinction. and she had the decorations and commendations to prove it. But she was also changed, marked by experiences that her family couldn't fully understand, and carrying wounds that would never completely heal. She was facing an uncertain future with no clear career path and questions about her identity beyond the military uniform she had worn for 8 years. "I think I'm going to be okay, Jake," she said finally. "I'm different than I was before, but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. I've learned things about myself and about life that I never would have learned otherwise. I'm stronger than I thought I was, and I'm more grateful for things I used to take for granted." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Like family dinners and front porch swings and really good ice cream?" "Exactly like that," Sarah smiled. "And like having a little brother who asks good questions and gives great hugs." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had been missing from her life for months. She was home, surrounded by love and support, with opportunities ahead and the strength to pursue them. The boarding gate incident that had seemed so devastating just days earlier now felt like part of a larger story about recognition, respect, and the power of good people to make things right. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she saw that it was from General Thompson's aide, Captain Morrison, following up on the General's promise to connect her with transition resources. "Lieutenant Chen, General Thompson asked me to reach out regarding opportunities for wounded warriors transitioning to civilian careers. Would you be available for a phone call next week to discuss programs that might be of interest to you? The General specifically mentioned your strong service record and wanted to ensure you have all available resources." Sarah showed the message to Jake, who whistled appreciatively. "Wow, you really made an impression on that General. This sounds like it could be really good for you." "I think it could be," Sarah agreed, typing back a response accepting the offer to discuss opportunities. "I think a lot of good things might be ahead." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their suburban neighborhood, Sarah Chen sat on her family's front porch and contemplated the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a boarding gate confrontation that had made her question her worth, to a general's intervention that had restored her faith in military leadership, to this peaceful evening surrounded by family love and future possibilities. She was home, she was valued, and she was ready for whatever came next. The warrior's journey was far from over. It was simply entering a new phase, one filled with different challenges and different opportunities to serve and make a difference. And for the first time in months, that future felt bright with possibility rather than clouded with uncertainty. She was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star winner, and wounded warrior. But more than that, she was a young woman with a lifetime ahead of her and the strength to make it meaningful. The boarding gate incident would become a story she would tell for years to come, not as an example of discrimination or bureaucratic failure, but as a reminder of how one person with authority and compassion could change everything with a simple choice to do the right thing. It was a lesson in leadership that she would carry forward into whatever career awaited her, and a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with recognition, respect, and basic human dignity. As she finally headed inside to unpack her duffel bag and begin the next chapter of her life, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that she was home, she was valued, and she was ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead.